Some of the album covers are very explicit. In fact, they look like they should be in Playboy or Penthouse, some of them. And they're in the record bins available to young children. But others, you can't tell. I bought the Purple Rain album for our 11-year-old, and I didn't know that Darling Nikki was on it, and I felt that it was inappropriate for her and her 8- and 6-year-old sister to hear a song describing a girl masturbating in a hotel lobby.
These gays, they're trying to murder me.
What do I think of her?
Yes?
I don't think of her.
Goodbye. I'm off. Read about that in the New York fucking Post.
I'm not even going to honor you and your work here on this podcast in this day with a bit, because my palms are sweating. I'm furious.
I'm absolutely about to be crucified.
Here
Live
on
Eating
for free. Don't you fucking dare steal this intro from me after what you have done. After what you have done, you do not get to start this podcast.
Here we go.
Eating for free, the podcast recording live from the absolute edge of the internet. Let me say it one more time, just in case you haven't pressed record.
It's recording, don't worry, it's going, girl. 40
Make sure you get this, because I'm only going to say it once. My name is Joan Summers, Diva Supreme, who has never forgotten to hit record on this podcast.
You also don't hit record because I run the laptop.
Yeah, and
You've never done it before.
Hence, I've never forgotten.
I also have a 99.99% success rate at this point.
And where that happened to that 0.001%?
We are all humans, all right? I am your local producer. I am your
local. Keyword local.
Yeah, I can't say producer supreme at this point because errors have been made. I'm sorry, I'm not like you. I actually do make mistakes sometimes. It's a really horrible space
I
to be in.
literally can't relate to that. I've never made a mistake ever.
So if you can't tell what absolutely just happened right before we hit record, I wasn't hitting the record button when we started the 5 minutes of the intro we did originally. So unfortunately, the timelines have shifted and we are in the other reality that's worse. So
we're in the reality where people enjoyed Sam Smith's Grammy performance. Guys.
So what are we here for to talk about?
We already did a drum roll, and I'm gonna risk pissing off your neighbor a second time.
We can do it. It's okay. They'll survive.
Will you do a drum roll, please, while I insert some kind of dramatic fanfare under this?
What? I don't know. I'm using my chest.
Matt's like drum roll, and he does
I did it last time.
Me just like slapping my gargantuan breasts.
I only have one hand. I don't know what else there is.
Just like make it like a.
I
This is pop music that fucks. An oral history of outrage.
Oh,
Part
Mama.
1.
Here we go. This is a series, y'all.
It's a series.
This is a full production.
Have you heard? We're a podcast, and we have put our whole pussies into this. This series, you might say, also fucks.
Absolutely.
I'm very excited about this, everybody. We've been working on this for a while now. I've been literally deep down into the cavernous hole of the Library of Congress. I've read books. I've watched Senate hearings that are older than my parents.
Wow.
I've literally read manuscripts from the 1800s.
We do have source material that goes all the way back.
No, I have
all
source
the way
material that is older than anybody that anyone listening to this podcast knows who is currently alive.
Wow.
Because we're what? Academics.
This is a literary
We're geniuses.
podcast. We read, we fuck, and we podcast.
Well, some of us read. Some of us read.
Oh, excuse me?
Oh! No, I was making a really mean-spirited dyslexia joke because I was still feeling spiteful.
Wow. We go for the low blows. That's
We go
what
for the
do.
lowest of possible
Making fun of my
lows.
learning disability. That's where we're at today.
If I can't make fun of your learning disability, what can I make fun of?
And what can I make fun of for you?
Let's see.
Say this carefully.
Being a woman, bipolar, alcoholic.
Oh, I haven't experimented with that one
drug
yet.
addict. I have bangs again.
The worst crime.
I've willingly decided to move to the state of Pennsylvania. I've like
There are a series of decisions here that are up for the taking, absolutely.
I'm giving you ammunition. I'm literally giving you ammunition.
Make
a joke.
ammunition we're gonna have against Sam Smith and Kim Petras for everything that happened last weekend.
And then I started blasting.
The timing could not be more hilarious.
Yeah, you could say I'm a genius who knows everything and has 100% with near total accuracy predicted everything about the course of human history since I've been alive. And
like this,
you'd be
this
right.
extremely mediocre performance happened, and you were like, light bulb appeared above your head
Oh,
in full
no.
3D reality, rotating.
No, I
in
was
360
already
degrees.
writing this before the performance. I just literally am that intelligent of a
That's
human
terrifying.
being.
The power is absolutely
Because you can actually go back
surging.
and you can look at my text messages with Virgil from like over a week ago about this. Shout out Big Soy Naturals. Catch me on Valentine's Day doing all your questions about love and sex on Big Soy Naturals. That's just a plug for our sister podcast.
Absolutely.
Shout out Virgil and Kenny. Anyways, so this is going to be a quite expansive 4-part history of obscenity and outrage about popular music and culture in the United States. And I was really inspired by our Balenciaga series, and it's something I've been thinking about since the Balenciaga series. We've seen this dramatic rise in outrage against pop stars and drag performers, books, movies, culture. It's something people talk about every time a teenager gets mad that a movie has sex scenes in it, or, you know, a character in a book has sex and suddenly the book is endorsing sex, you know, that sort of thing. You've seen it about your favorite TV shows. You've seen it about the music you listen to. You've seen it about your favorite drag queens. You've seen it literally in your own communities, in your own families. And it can sometimes feel like, and it has, to me, it sometimes felt like, what the fuck is happening? Has the entire world gone crazy?
There are so many things that we're going to review in this series that literally were written centuries back, and you are going to think this was written today. Like,
Yeah.
we have a Daily Beast op-ed that is on par with the same things these losers were talking about back in the 50s when there was a little too much pep in someone's step on stage and they thought the world was ending. It's wild.
And why Matt brings that up, and kind of to my point also, is that when you feel like this, it can be so easy, especially as like communists that are constantly thinking about the state of the world and capitalism and
society,
heteropatriarchal
imperialism and its consequences.
It can feel so hard to just like confront this all the time. But something that I have found extremely soothing about doing this series, but also just being reminded of by doing this series, is that we are not the first people in this world to confront the forces that be, the forces that dictate our reality and the forces that threaten our now existence very presently here in the 2020s.
Yeah.
And that ultimately a lot of what we're going to be talking about is things that are contemporary to us here in the present, but also speak to ultimately what does feel like at times a battle for the soul of the human race that has spanned centuries and we're talking like centuries now.
Yeah.
Like, we are fighting forces that are so beyond you and me and everyone listening to this podcast combined. And thinking of it in that way and reminding myself that people 200 years ago were having the same fears and confronting these same forces and feeling like they were just so unstoppable and so much larger than us reminds me of not just why it isn't so important to like find community with people, but also why it is so important to remember that we are not uniquely special at this point in time.
Yeah.
That we are taught a view of history that teaches us everything happens chronologically, and it's this thing and then this thing and then this thing, and all of them are distinct and materially different. But ultimately, it is a lot of things happening at once, and oftentimes things happening all at once over the span of thousands of years. And
This really does go all
so
the way back to then. If we just had found source material that far back, like we could have, we would have. Like,
well, I did. There were things that the Greeks were saying that I'm just like, we didn't need to go to Greece.
Yeah, we could, but
we didn't need to go BC for this to make our point.
Yeah, exactly.
So over the course of this series, we are really going to be talking about contemporary American life because that is what we know. And it is where a lot of these forces are currently at play. So we are going to speak to what we know. And we are not necessarily well-published historians. And so we're approaching this the only way that we can and with as much principled guidance as we possibly can bring to it. But we really hope that you guys enjoy this. In the first part today, we are specifically going to be starting in the 1800s and then fast forwarding to the 1980s, and you'll see why. And then in the next episode, we will be discussing the satanic panic in rock music. Mm-hmm. In part 3, we're going to be talking about the explosion of pop and rap in the 90s and obscenity trials about rap music, as well as the careers of people like Madonna and George Michael. And then in the final series, we are going to be discussing the origins of the quote unquote sexualized pop star in the 2000s. We're talking Britney, Christina Aguilera, Beyonce, people like Destiny's Child, all the way to the Disney stars like Miley, Demi Lovato, Selena Gomez, that sort of thing.
And it will go all the way to today?
Yeah, and that will run all the way to today. So to really kind of just like situate us, if you will, and what we are talking about today specifically, and what really ultimately kind of is the linchpin for this series, Kim Petras and Sam Smith performed together a duet, if that is how we could describe this performance.
It was a performance
of the song that you have heard on TikTok, which we will not play here, but it's like the that one. You've heard it and you hate it.
Yeah.
I know you hate it. If you're listening to this,
it's called
you hate
Unholy,
it.
and it is unholy. Absolutely.
It's not a good song.
Not on my app, but
you know, they performed it at the Grammys and have since received backlash from, of course, the expected people, because in this performance, as we got here from ET, but also just if you watched it, they played basically like satanic panic, devils in cages, chains and whips excite me,
red and
blood and bondage things. And Satanism.
I mean, quite literally devil horns, that kind of thing.
You know, we had drag queens in the performance. I know specifically Violet Chachki was in the performance. Gottmik was also at the Grammys. I think Gottmik was in the performance
and the red carpet, especially.
And on the red carpet. After all of this happened, there was a bunch of obviously backlash from Fox News and conservative media outlets and like people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, whatnot, what have you. There is a huge meltdown on the Christian right. Now, I have condensed this down a little bit, but you have an op-ed here in Vice, and then an op-ed, you have an op-ed in the Daily Beast and a story from Vice.
And then Vice has just a collection of the stuff.
Yeah, let's talk about Vice's thing first, just so we can get kind of a rundown of the drama, and then we'll read this Daily Beast thing. And just for anyone who might get confused or hasn't kept up on the news, Sam Smith goes by they, them pronouns. So in case you haven't kept up on the news, that is where Sam Smith is at. Let's read some of these tweets. So what is Vice saying?
Yeah. So of course, immediately after the performance, a lot of the popular kind of Christian right people on Twitter and other news outlets had immediate outrage. What didn't help with all of this was, of course, Pfizer was the main sponsor for the Grammys. So you could assume the devil imagery as well as the vaccine sponsorship was kind of a perfect combination for Q and adjacent people. So as we know, Sam Smith and Kim Petras gave their performance for the song Unholy, red leather, cages, flames, Dominic's-esque dancers, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people were tweeting, specifically Marjorie Taylor Greene, our, favorite enemy, said the Grammys featured Sam Smith's demonic performance and was sponsored by Pfizer. And the Satanic Church now has an abortion clinic in New Mexico that requires its patients to perform a satanic ritual before its services. American Christians need to get to work. Don't know how they connect, but they apparently do. First, Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company that came out for the first COVID-19 vaccine, was, of course, the year's sponsor. Then there was Smith, who was targeted by a lot of culture wars in the past few years. So this has been building up by a lot of the same people that we have been discussing in these alt-right spaces. After the win in performances, Turning Point USA founder and conservative influencer Charlie Kirk went on a multi-part tweet thread in which he attempted to draw a connection between the satanic theme and Smith's and Petras' performance and the fact that Pfizer was among its year's sponsors at the Grammys. Kirk also posted a screenshot of the performance with the caption, quote, "definitely not a spiritual war." The post-millennial right-wing outlet wrote, breaking, Sam Smith stages Satanic Grammy performance with strippers at double horns. Of course, right-wing commentator Liz Wheeler also said on Twitter, don't fight the culture wars, they say. Meanwhile, demons are teaching her kids to worship Satan. I could throw up. It's the same thing every time.
Yeah, I mean, and
Nothing
again,
nuanced
most
to it
of the
all.
like Satanism claims are very giving the Monster Energy Satan panic woman
Yes.
bottoms up
Yep,
and the
but
devil
devil
laughs.
laughs,
That's like the level of like Satan worship
This
analysis.
is the same shit we saw with Balenciaga. I mean, if anything, the performance from Sam Smith and Kim Petras was a bit more on the nose with satanic imagery, but very similar reactions. So we did link here a Daily Beast article that is, I think, a really good way to get started with how we're going to frame all of this, because there are the people who are in the conspiracy theory lane of QAnon, Pfizer, it's all connected. They're trying to indoctrinate our children. The codes are right in front of us. There's that. Yeah. That's its own fringe thing. And then there's the people who don't care. They have a great time watching satanic imagery, whatever, what have you. It's artistic, blah, blah, blah. Then there are the people who are in the middle, who are very much opposed to this, not from a conspiracy theory lens, but from a protecting the children and morality lens. And mainstream
and
TV
also
and censorship.
Not even just protecting the children, but like in the liberal view, it's like, yes, I believe people should be free to express themselves, but also it's unhelpful to dress up as Satan because you're just pissing off the Christians and we need them on our base.
Yes.
And so why are you willingly being sacrilegious if you know it's going to make these people mad?
Yes.
And it's kind of what we said about Balenciaga. And before you kind of get into this, I did clip this down a little bit because again, we don't need to read the entire bullshit that this Daily Beast writer puts together. But, you know, with Balenciaga, what I was saying about those photos, specifically Gabriel Galimberti's photos, was, you know, what we're really ultimately fighting for now is the essence of art itself, right? That we are now fighting for a world, not just for bad art to exist, but for like art to exist at all, right? Because we have people who want to completely tamp down on human expression, even the kind of human expression that you might not like, right? Like you might not really be down with like Satan imagery, but like people are saying now that because someone might not be down with Satan imagery, that we should not even play in the realm of fantasies with this at all. And that art itself should be completely neutered, tested on mass audiences, able to be streamed on Disney Plus in front of a 3-year-old, right? And so
this will be a conversation we'll have later where it's about, is it censorship or is it prohibition? Like, should it not be allowed at all, or should it be something that you can watch, but you have to pass a filter, pay money, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes.
So
what is some of these little clippings from this Daily Beast article?
So I'll read in some of the literal words here because I think it is like, you have to be in the mind of this person to see what they're saying. So further in the piece, after they describe the performance and the ludicrousness of it, the author writes, but even as you see the satanic shtick as more shocking than disturbing, it's hard to make the case that images of women grinding in cages are appropriate for network television on a Sunday night during prime time, a time when the broadest audience is available, including children, are watching. As far as I'm concerned, willing adults can watch this all they want, but last night's TV audience didn't buy a ticket for this. Indeed, a show intended for general audiences, it was meant to provoke, to push boundaries, and very possibly designed to offend a good portion of the audience. And when you're sticking your finger in the eyes of a million people, it's really hard to argue with those that say Hollywood produces a mainstream popular culture that is openly tolerant of their values. This is where it starts to get a lot... It's also hard to tell them that they're wrong and intolerant if they would prefer to check out, unplug the TV, and homeschool their kids. Choice is a two-way street, and many are making the informed choice to tune out while they still can. I may be more attuned to this than some, but almost every Sunday, my wife and I sit in the back pew of a conservative church. About once a month, the pastor preaches about how bad things are in America and how our culture is so debauched and depraved.
Okay, so you go to a homophobic church.
I was like... Wow.
And you're admitting to this.
Telling on yourself quite quickly here.
And you're okay with that.
And I'm sure they have lots of great things to say about vaccines.
You go to the church, you sit there every Sunday and you listen to the hatefulness and you're like, yeah, but you know what? These people should be hateful and we need to cater to their needs.
And then he has this whole paragraph about like, oh, the whole going to hell in the basket sermons are a little ridiculous. You know, I do live a charmed life and blah, 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 blah. But, you know, millions of conservatives in America, irrespective of what they ever, you know, set foot in a church, this would be offensive too. And then they end it here. And whatever you think about the whatever you think about the artistic value of the Grammys Satan dance routine, it wasn't meant to win hearts and minds or to encourage mutual tolerance and respect. It was rough stuff and a massive turnoff to people concerned that our culture has become too hostile to too many people's traditional religious values.
And again, the keynote here is that they are the center of America and that there are the needs that we need to be most catering to.
And that all art should be about morality and education and doing the right thing? Okay, and then this is the last part here. We'll end it here. Make no mistake, that sort of thing has political ramifications. While responsible conservatives worry about our coarsened culture, some of their cousins on the illiberal MAGA right now want to exploit the sense that our elites in news and entertainment media aren't just out of touch with middle American values, they're outright demonic. I don't even know how to respond to it without just responding to everything we're about to say after this.
Yeah. So just think about that in your mind.
Think about that. Think about that framing. Now, think about this weird, independent, neoliberal kind of take that we're seeing.
So
it'll apply to the rest.
For this specific episode, we're going to be talking a lot from PDFs, and we're going to be talking a lot from books, and we're going to be talking a lot from historical records. So we have done our best to link everything in our show notes for you to read. There is a lot of sources for this episode, and it is a lot of very long and detailed sources. We're talking hundreds of pages of documents.
Scholarly articles.
So we just are going to do our best to condense this information. Some of this information is primary sources. Some of this is synthesized historical opinions from different historians and commentators, etc. So we're going to do our best to clarify which is which. The first thing that we're going to be reading is from Jeffrey R. Stone in the First Amendment Law Review. This was a presentation he gave to the First Amendment Law Review that was later put together as an actual document that you can read and go back and listen to. It is Sex and the First Amendment, the long and winding history of obscenity law. This was in 2019. You can find the link to the WordPress where this was published as a PDF in our notes. And I'm not going to be reading directly from George Stone the whole time. I'll make sure to, when I do directly quote him, say so. But I'm going to be kind of using this as a touchstone because he's a law professor and it's a really incomprehensive look at obscenity in the United States. Now, before we start anything, obscenity is a word we're going to be using a lot here. And obscenity is, obviously a larger version of obscene. Mm-hmm. We're talking things that are sexual, things that are considered graphic. Explicit is another popular word for this. Mature content. And a lot of the accusations being thrown at Sam Smith in a court of law, when this is being discussed, we would be discussing this as an obscenity trial. Yeah. If, say, someone was to sue Sam Smith or sue the Grammys or sue the network for showcasing this and it being obscene, quote unquote. And you might think to yourself, that's so weird. I can't believe someone would do that. They can sue for obscene materials.
Oh, they have. Many a times.
We'll get into the FTC later.
Lobbies with this
We'll get into the lobbies later. But we're going to kind of take a look all the way back into the 1840s, starting to the present, and talk a little bit about the history of obscenity and specifically how it became a term that is used in broader legal circles in the United States and how it informed culture in the United States. So,
because with anything judicial, there's precedent that goes all the way back to its first origin. So that's why we have to start here because it's a storyline.
100%. So again, Sex and the First Amendment, the long and winding history of obscenity law from Jeffrey R. Stone. So I'm going to start here. So the very first obscenity prosecution in the United States happened in, I'm going to give everyone a second here to guess, Philadelphia. Now, when you're talking about history, obviously, when you're hearing things like the very first time a guy was arrested for being naked in public, it's probably going to happen on the East Coast, and it's probably going to happen in New Jersey or Philadelphia or New York or DC, because these are very old cities. So
and California was barely happening.
Not necessarily shocking that it happened in Philly, but it is just kind of funny that it happened in Philly. So It happened in 1815 at the height of what Stone describes is the evangelical explosion of the Second Great Awakening, which triggered a nationwide effort to transform American law and politics through the lens of evangelical Christianity.
Yeah.
We've never experienced that before. That feels so
Evangelicals
unrelatable.
involved in the court system?
So I'm getting this from Boston University for a summary of the Second Great Awakening because I was acquainted with it because I went to religious school my entire life. So of course I knew the Second Great Awakening, but I wasn't going to go consult my ninth grade textbooks for this. So from Boston University, quote, in the early part of the 19th century, the United States experienced a tremendous surge in religious fervor among Protestants as revivals became popular in various parts of the country. While the Second Great Awakening does not refer to an exact time period, one of its starting points has been identified as the revival held at Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801, which was... which is the name that refers to the fact that this period followed the First Great Awakening, which was a period of intense religious interest in the 1730s and 1740s. Its strongest proponents wanted to shape the law to their newfound religious fervor, which in part influenced the prosecution. Okay, so now we're getting back to Stone. So this explosion of religious interest and the fervor that they felt about Jesus and saving the soul of the country, all of these, especially working class people in small towns across the eastern seaboard, were going to these revivals in these large tents, and there were these pastors preaching doom and gloom, right?
Yeah.
This is a time when obviously slavery is still legal. There are extreme racial and class tensions in the United States, as even just the very slight whiff of a concept of the middle class started to percolate in the greater cultural consciousness, or at least people in urban areas that were neither extremely poor or extremely wealthy. And in places like New York City, those people were not always white men in their 30s with a white wig on that you see in all the historical paintings, right? And so there was just a lot of tension. Women's role within society was changing. There was growing unrest amongst the North versus the South. This was pre-Civil War. You also had abolitionists fighting against slavery. And there was just a lot of forces at play that was changing the fabric of what at that point was a very small United States. And the religious right, we can call them by today's standards, saw this huge explosion of people, returning to the roots, returning to Jesus, finding the soul of the country again, that sort of thing. It's pretty easy to see how that kind of thing can happen in times of extreme political unrest. So, during this time, its proponents wanted to shape the law to their newfound religious fervor, and in part, it influenced the prosecution of a tavern owner in Philadelphia named Jesse Sharpless, who was exhibiting what we would describe as porn now, but of course he wasn't popping in a DVD or going to pornhub.com.
Yeah. At this time in history, I don't even know how they're depicting it at this point.
Yeah, it's described as, and I don't have an exact rendering of whatever it was, nor is there too much detail that I was finding in just my in very basic research about Jesse Sharpless, but it was quote unquote lewd renderings of a man and a woman engaged in some sort of sexual activity and just generally debaucherous art on display. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court accused Sharpless at the time of, quote, inflaming the passions of youths in the area, and that it made the act worthy of a criminal trial. The fact that Sharpless had done something in the community where, quote unquote, youths could be inflamed was, in the 1815 era, worthy of criminal prosecution. Think about that, right? Think about that and just hold it in your heart because it does sound very familiar to us. So this was a rare occurrence at the time. It wasn't like every single person in the United States was getting accused of being obscene or being taken to court by Pennsylvania.
I'm sure
or
it required kind of
places.
an economy of scale too for this to be a community issue.
It was a rare occurrence, but it's notable because it was the first one, obviously. So the Second Great Awakening did not last forever. It wanes, and as it wanes, Stone and other historians both note that porn and otherwise obscene materials saw a slight uptick.
I would say during
culture.
the Civil War, of course, it's not shocking that would become something
the
more
war,
desired.
and there's just a lot of other things going on, and the religious sector starts to lose its grip on the hearts and minds of people. And you start seeing magazines or newspapers at the time, like Flash, Rake, and Libertine, which were all different, quote unquote lewd magazines is the only way to explain them.
Yes.
That were common later in the 1800s. Stone also says that during the Civil War, there is an organization that gets founded that we are all very well acquainted with, especially if you're from the suburbs, called the Young Men's Christian Association, otherwise known as the YMCA. And he says in this piece, quote, "It had been established by a group of ministers and righteous businessmen in the 1840s to give God-fearing men a place for proper leisure activities away from the quote-unquote moral maelstrom of developing urban areas like New York City." Again, we're thinking about these things. We're like, oh my God, this sounds very familiar to us.
This is very much like the path to progress, right? The second people start to organize and change the culture, there's a group of people that are
like, wait a
fearing
minute.
what society's turning to.
Wait a minute. You guys are reading nasty magazines in New York City. We better do something about that. Okay, so I'm going to kind of breeze through this a little bit because I don't want to spend too long in the 1800s before we get to the 1980s.
Yes.
So in 1868, the YMCA successfully lobbies New York for a bill that made it a crime to sell any sort of material with quote unquote obscene or indecent content. This is later known as the Comstock era, which lasts up through the early 1900s and is so called after the YMCA's chief inspector, Anthony Comstock, who really took to the role as soon as he was appointed by the ministers that formed the society. It is an era, the Comstock era, permeated by fears of the devil's temptations and adherence by Comstock of absolute penitence, purity, and abstinence. From Stone, he says, quote, "After organizing his squad, which he named the Committee for the Suppression of Vice, Comstock led several successful raids on local New York City publishers, but soon realized that to make a truly major impact, he would need national legislation." So he goes...
It's like vigilantism almost before it becomes law, which is
He goes to
crazy.
Washington with the backing of the YMCA to lobby for federal law and warns Congress that obscenity was a, quote, hydra-headed monster that requires a potent legislative weapon. So in March 3rd, 1873, the stupid bitch known as President Ulysses Grant, I couldn't tell you exactly the stupid bitchness, but I just know I don't like him.
We don't like any president. Let's just get that first
if you're
and foremost.
president in the 1800s, you're a stupid bitch.
If you're president anytime. It sucks.
But I'm sure, don't quote me on him being a stupid bitch, with specifics, because, again, I'm talking about obscenity. We're not talking about Ulysses Grant. Okay.
Yes.
So he signs into law the, quote, Act for the Suppression of Trade in and Circulation of Obscene Literatures and Articles of Immoral Use, which
gotta
is
love it.
quite a mouthful. March 3rd, 1873. Also my birthday.
What? You're right.
Funny,
Oh my God.
just a funny little thing.
They saw you coming. They saw you coming
I
centuries
share a birthday
away.
with the, quote, Act for the Suppression of Trade and Circulation of Obscene Literatures and Articles of Immoral
You know what? I
Use.
do like the trade and circulation of, because I'm sure not only things just really did move around like that, especially pornography, because there wasn't just a huge distributor like Pornhub sitting around giving it out for free. But I bet you that also includes pornographic or quote unquote obscene material probably traded through by other countries and other foreign governments.
I wonder.
People who went
I
to
would
the
need
US,
to know.
because I'm sure there's varying standards of what's obscene depending on what country you're coming
this
from.
legislation establishes a broad ban on all items that could be deemed obscene, lewd, lascivious, or filthy, but it does not, and this is extremely important.
This is the center of it all.
It does not define those terms. Now, this is key because for literally 100 years following this act, that is at the center of everything. The fact that the
still
bill
is now,
does
even.
not define what that is. So, the law authorized severe penalties, which include hard labor, and empowers the post office to censor and confiscate any objectionable material. Comstock was also appointed as special postal agent, and fittingly, the law became known as the Comstock Act. Also, Ashlyn would like to inform all of us that when I said Ulysses Grant was a stupid bitch, it was because Ashlyn had said stupid bitch in the chat, but was referring to Comstock. Although, again, I'm sticking by the fact
All
that
of them are
Ulysses
dumb.
Grant
These
was a
are-
stupid
this
bitch.
is stories about dummies.
Again, you're a man in the 1800s. You weren't up to anything good. You were president of the United States after the Civil War. You weren't up to anything good. Okay. So, Comstock asserts in this time that lust defiles the body,
Oh, here we go.
debauches the imagination, corrupts the mind, and damns the soul.
Because of course, well, we do have to be like, it's just so much to say, but we have to understand that these people really do believe, and people still now do believe, as we're seeing with even the Sam Smith performance, that watching this or consuming or enjoying this content will put you in eternal damnation.
Yes.
That's what's at stake for these people. We have to remember that.
So, the 20th century commences, and courts find it difficult to define the nature of obscenity because, again, the Comstock Act did not define the nature of obscenity.
And how law works is if you are not
was-
specific, it will be debated.
Yes,
ad
and it
infinitum.
was a nebulous term that was basically anything that leads to immoral behavior or debauchery. And again, you're like, what's immoral behavior? The subtext here is immoral behavior according to the Bible.
Yeah, I was gonna say, anything that's not Christian.
Yeah. They didn't put that in the law, what Jesus Christ would do, but they might as well have.
Oh, because church and state are supposed to be separated?
Okay.
Anyway.
Now, we are going to, in this particular episode, just briefly brush past what is also known as the Hays era in Hollywood, because it is something that people have done to death in podcasting,
we'd have to
the
do a
Hays
whole
Code
episode
era.
on it,
You
honestly.
could literally go, you could listen to You're Wrong about it. Like, we don't need to waste our time on the Hays Code. You can go listen to, like, You're Wrong, Be Kind
You're Wrong
Rewind on YouTube, listen to You're Wrong About. Like, there's a million books about it. We all know what the Hays Code is. So we're going to kind of brush past that because we already know, we've talked about it extensively here on the podcast. So like I said, as the 20th century commences, courts find it very difficult. However, Stone asserts that the Supreme Court acted as though obscenity was outside the bounds of the First Amendment and not guarded by the press or freedom of speech. Now, while I discuss this court case, do you mind looking up Roth versus the United States just so that we can get the names and key events of Roth versus the United States?
Yeah.
While I explain this, so Roth versus the United States in 1957 was a landmark case in which Justice Brennan Jr. wrote in his opinion that the court had officially accepted obscenity as, quote, outside the bounds of the First Amendment, and that sex has, quote, indisputably been a subject of absorbing interest to mankind throughout the ages. In their opinion about this case, however, the court also maintained that the government could only intervene where obscenity was defined as, quote, censorable as sexual expression only if material judged as a whole appeals primarily, to the prurient interest in sex, is patently offensive to contemporary community standards and lacks any redeeming social value. Now, let me say that again. Is patently offensive to contemporary community standards and lacks any redeeming social value. Because that is really, again, like the Comstock Act, the heart of this matter. That people are at war over who gets to decide what contemporary community standards are and what those social values are. And in our society today, as well as in 1957 and in the 1800s when the Comstock Act was passed, those social values are primarily based on white, heteropatriarchal racists who inflame the passions of their church congregations into emailing letters to the FTC about Sam Smith and Kim Petras. Now, Roth versus the United States.
Yeah. So Samuel Roth was a man who ran an adult book-selling business in New York City and was convicted under a federal statute criminalizing the sending of, again, quote, obscene, lewd, lascivious. My dyslexia is not going to let me say that word. Or filthy materials through the mail for advertising and selling a publication called American Aphrodite, and I love this, parentheses, a quarterly for the fancy-free, containing literary erotica, nude photography, etc. David Alberts, who ran a mail order business from Los Angeles, was also convicted under California statute for selling lewd and obscene books, because apparently this was also a like sister case with the with what was it here? Yeah, Miller versus California as well, because the court granted certiorari and affirmed both convictions.
So, as Stone notes, this not only broadened widely available sexual materials, but saw a trend towards the later sexual revolution of the 1960s as America abandoned Victorian values. So when you read this, right, you're like, oh, this is going to open up the door to bad things, right? But what it also did on the flip side was broadly defined things like what Roth was selling as not inherently offensive to broader cultural standards. And later in the 1960s, as the sexual revolution happened, it was used as a defense of like, well, this society that we live in is sex positive, or like down with watching a movie about women masturbating or whatever, what have you, right? I'm not talking like in the broadest terms where that was always 100% applicable, but because the opinion was vague, it opened the door to people defending the use of, selling of, and dissemination of these materials by saying, well, who is it offending, right? It's totally fine in my community, right? But it also allows later on in the 70s and 80s, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, people like the PMRC, Tipper Gore, and the like to both inflame the Satanic Panic scandals as well as campaign for explicit warnings on rock music albums because they were a danger to the community and a danger to children. So going back to Stone, he notes that in the 60s, and this is just a really interesting little fact that has very little to do with what we're talking about, but really kind of sets up the just farce of the American legal system. He says that in the 60s, the court annually convened a meeting where clerks and justices watched materials in pending obscenity cases.
This is wild to
He
me.
says that it was an era because of all these pending obscenity cases of just legal chaos where, quote, the court's inability to articulate a clear definition of obscenity in part contributed to the explosion of publicly available graphic materials because there was not a clear-cut definition of this. He says that in these weekly meetings, they would basically pile up all the materials that were going to be on trial and just watch through them to define what obscenity was. So like all the porn films and
I'm
all
sure
the
nothing
fucking
weird was going on
photographs.
during that time. I also do love how it's noted here that Justices Douglas and
Yeah,
Black
I was just about to get to there.
never went because in their view there was no such thing as obscenity. And at one point Black even said, and this is a quote here, if I wanted to go see a dirty film, I should pay my money. Like support artists.
In his final years on the court, Justice Harlan was losing his eyesight, and his law clerks for another justice had to describe in detail the action on screen. This was very awkward. There was also these moments of levity, however, mixed in with the misery of having to spend like literally hours watching porn with old men
And I
in the
bet that
Supreme
old
Court.
porn was some weird shit too. I bet they were up to some
So
things.
the law clerks, for example, frequently mocked Justice Potter Stewart's definition of obscenity and shouted out raucously in the darkened room, quote, that's it, I know it when I see
Now
it.
that quote really, it's still prevalent today as a thing people say. And I remember when I was younger, I've heard that before many times, and it's been in like the law classes I've had to take for my degree and everything like that. But that I know it when I see it. Mama, you don't know it when you see it. Not in the 21st century, but we'll get to that later.
We're going to jump back now in time to the 1940s because, shocking, America is a very big country and there's a lot of things going on all at once. So we've kind of set up the legal framework here, but let's kind of dive into now some of the cultural frameworks for music specifically. Because like I said, we didn't want to get into the Hays Code because it's about movies, and we're specifically talking about music and how music has been used as a tool by both radicals, the right, revolutionaries, and basically everyone in between throughout the history of America and really human civilization. But we're specifically talking about music. So as kind of a reprieve from the legal case framework that Stone has very nicely, thankfully, pointed out for us, I'm going to play a clip from Howlin' Wolf's Smokestack Lightning. It's a live concert that he did in 1964. And this is from the Reelin' in the Years archive. We're gonna get into who Howlin' Wolf is, but needless to say, he's one of the most famous and well-renowned blues musicians of all time. And we're just gonna kind of get into this music because I want to set up the sound of the era and really kind of the sound of what this music was about and who was singing it and really the politics of this. So I'm just gonna play a short clip and then we'll kind of get into Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters and Chicago blues music. So that was Smokestack Lightning by Howlin' Wolf in 1964 at the famed American Folk Blues Festival in the UK, but it was a song from back in the day. We're talking 1940s. Howlin' Wolf was extremely famous at that time in 1964, but had been for many, many years chart topping on the billboards. Just a little bit of background on Howlin' Wolf before we get into our next reading. He is one of the most famous blues musicians of all time, as I've said, as well as a prolific singer and guitarist. He's credited as bridging what are distinctly known as the styles of Delta blues and Chicago blues when he moved from Chicago from the Mississippi Delta in the 40s. He began recording officially in 1951 and has at that time in 1951 up through 1964 managed to get 5 songs onto the then extremely new Billboard national R&B charts. Like, think about that. In the 50s, the R&B charts were brand new. Like, that's
crazy.
How contemporary this history is. And of course, we know everything else also happening in the 1950s, in the 1940s, and the 1960s as well, right? America's still dealing with the legacy of slavery very keenly. Sharecropping is still in practice. We also are leading up to the civil rights movement properly in the 1960s. And needless to say, there was a lot of extreme racial tensions in America. Segregation was still in effect, and we still had in Chicago segregated music channels as well. Yeah. So we're going to get into now a book that I read, The Black Musician and the White City, Race and Music in Chicago by Amy Absher. This covers 1900 to 1967. But specifically, we're going to be reading from pages 96 and 97 in the PDF we have linked. Not the pages in the book we have linked, but the pages in the PDF if you want to follow along. So we're going to kind of get into a little bit of the music history at the time in Chicago, specifically for blues artists. Give me just one moment to pull this up. So this is from chapter 3, right? Redefining the music industry, independent music in Chicago, 1948 to 1953. So we're going to read directly from this. Consider for a moment that Muddy Waters, a famous blues musician at the time and who would later become an obviously very famous blues musician in Chicago, was a sharecropper when he migrated to Chicago in 1943. But by no end of the 1950s, the historical statistics of the United States no longer listed the category of sharecropping as an occupation. His initial identity as a plantation laborer was disappearing in the United States. In addition, the railway line running from his plantation home to Chicago, the same railway used by most African American migrants after the Great Depression, was out of service by the late 1950s. America had changed so much by the 1950s that Howlin' Wolf, who would be one of Waters' greatest competitors, drove a 2-tone DeSoto from Memphis to Chicago in 1952. He had $3,900 in cash in his pocket and was leaving his record contract with Sun Records in Memphis for a job with Chess Records in Chicago. He claimed, quote, "I'm the onlyest one drove out of the South like a gentleman." Upon Wolf's arrival in Chicago, he rented a room from Waters. The Chicago veteran also introduced Wolf to the club circuit. Wolf would never scab, play on the street corners in the Maxwell district, or starve, as Waters and the earlier generations of working-class musicians had. Instead, he immediately took a regular gig at Club Zanzibar. By this time, the electric blues was well established in Chicago. When Waters went on tour, Wolf filled him in for clubs Wolf filled in for him in clubs throughout the city. Quote, "I found it easy," Wolf said, "because people had hears about me before I come. The records were out before I come to Chicago. Then I went stretching out all across town. After people found I was there, they commenced giving me jobs." Wolf knew his experience differed from that of other musicians, and he was proud of it, declaring, quote, "I only played at one house rent party here." The divergent migration narratives of Waters and Wolf illustrate how much change had occurred in Chicago. Waters' motivation for leaving the South was not a record contract, but fears of violence from an overseer. He left the South carrying a suit of clothes and a guitar. Upon his arrival, he could not find enough work as a musician, so he worked in the factories and drove a delivery truck. Wolf, on the other hand, came to the city with money in his pocket. He owned a car. He found work as a musician quickly. The difference in these narratives suggests that there had been a remarkable change between 1943, when Waters arrived in Chicago, and 1952, when Wolf permanently moved to Chicago. The change had accelerated in 1948 when Muddy Waters partnered with independent European ethnic music producers and assisted by independent disc jockeys, resisted, and this is very important, so listen to this, the American Federation of Musicians' ban on recordings. For decades, Black musicians in Chicago had been practicing daily acts of resistance, such as scabbing, but none of these acts had resulted in any significant change in the complex system of segregation that governed Chicago and the music industry. Resisting the union ban started a whirlwind of change in the music industry that pushed African American performers in music to the top of the music charts. Their domination of the charts was significant given that in previous decades it was difficult for them to obtain recording contracts and radio would only broadcast white performers. By violating the ban and gaining access to recording and radio, the musicians found a way to reach beyond the physical boundaries of segregation. Though African American musicians in Chicago were still unable to play in venues and found it difficult to live beyond the boundaries of the Black neighborhoods, white youth were still able to buy Black music in the 1950s because of the use of radio and jukeboxes as a means of distribution. This momentary shift in industry power towards an independent record labels and the Black musicians only lasted 5 years, but it forever transformed the relationships between people and music in the United States, and it created an environment in which Howlin' Wolf could arrive in Chicago with relative comfort.
I think what I really like about that excerpt there too, that's going to be really prevalent throughout the entire rest of the series, is that the popularity of music that is in this time and in times now discouraged or wanting to be banned or removed from the radio, the popularity is what always keeps it going. People literally can't stop listening to music that they're told not to because it's good and it's interesting and it has things that we want to learn about, and the people who make them would do well in those spaces because people enjoy it. And it's just crazy how often that's the narrative we're going to see here.
So we're now going to read a little bit from Louder Sound. I'm getting most of this information from an article in Louder Sound called Why They Tried to Censor the Blues. And this is going to explain a little bit of the backstory and the history of what we just read from in The Black Musician in the White City. So from Louder Sound specifically, notable chess records blues artists were people like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf in its various guises throughout time, as boogie woogie, as R&B, as British blues, and as rock and roll. The blues had been accused of corrupting the youth, encouraging sexual depravity, and even inciting murder. In response, both external and internal forces worked to repress the blues, with it reaching a crescendo in the 1950s. The McCarthy-era United States were seeped in fear and intolerance. As blues and rock and roll took hold, censorship loomed large as the older generation fought to enforce morality and prevent the corruption of the youth. While the blues as a music genre is undoubtedly older, the first blues recording was by an African-American singer and widely credited as Mamie Smith's Jazz Hound's 1920 rendition of Perry Bradford's Crazy Blues. The recording of the song sold more than 1 million copies and led the way for the professionalization of blues music. For the first time, record labels became aware of the huge market for what they deemed as quote-unquote race records. And again, this was in the 1920s, 1930s, and they're calling it race records. Like, again, think about how contemporary this history is. So, still the recording industry was, at the time, strictly segregated. Music by Black artists was strictly targeted at Black audiences, and music by white artists would be exclusively for white audiences. It wasn't until the 1940s that radio stations began to air music aimed at a crossover of the two. For the first time, white audiences began to listen to Black artists and discovered rhythm and blues, later coined R&B. Few artists, however, faced as much bigotry and censorship as Billie Holiday, as well as being both female and a Black person in America, Holiday's tough upbringing, including being put to work as a prostitute by her own mother at the age of 13, resulted in a dark songbook with distressing lyrics that America wasn't ready to hear. When Holiday's record label Columbia Records refused to record a song she had recorded, she released it on a small independent label, Commodore Records. Many radio stations refused to play it, and a number of New York clubs banned Holiday from singing it. Nonetheless, the song sold well and was credited by some as sowing the seeds of the civil rights movement. Just a few years later, her song Gloomy Monday was refused airplay on many radio stations because it was alleged to encourage suicide. While these excuses were often thinly veiled attempts to cover up their racism, those themes of death and sex would arise again and again in the battle against the blues. And in the post-war early days of R&B, it wasn't just the lyrics that were causing the most offense, but the beat. Now, this is the key part here, because it goes back to what they were saying in the 1970s about inflaming the passions of the local youth. Quote, "It was the pulsating, repetitive sexual beat. Right-wing conservatives riled up against the, quote, vulgarity of what one opponent referred to as the, quote, animalistic obscenity of black rock and rollers. Other slurs referred to beats coming from the jungle and encouraged the self-expression of young people through sex. Throughout the 1950s, the FCC received an unprecedented number of complaints relating to, quote, obscene and indecent songs. The biggest issue for the FCC was deciphering between the two. The reason? American courts ruled that, quote, obscene songs could be banned outright, but the lesser of two evils, indecent songs, could only be regulated."
Yet we still haven't determined which is which.
Yes.
Where that lies.
And so there are now a few historical events that happen between the 1950s and the 1980s that I'm going to just encourage the audience to look into, because unfortunately we just don't have enough time to cover all of this. Obviously, most people listening to this podcast, I hope, have a general understanding of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And then in the 1970s, however, I would encourage all of you to look up Disco Demolition Night, which also happened coincidentally in Chicago. It was a night when there was a riot over the destruction and burning of disco music in Chicago, encouraged by a DJ who had lost his job because of disco music, as he claimed at the time. People involved in the riot and this DJ have since gone on to say it had nothing to do with the fact that disco music was loved by gay people and black people and young people in the city. It was just they didn't like disco music, and it's not deeper than that, right? But Disco Demolition Night and the anti-disco movement are other just kind of brief, broader cultural movements that happen around indecent music. But the reason why we are reaching into the 1980s is because of a shift that starts to happen, both culturally and legally. And it's interesting because it is one of those moments in history where you can see two forces intersecting and opposing each other, and what they produce in that intersection is pretty extreme, but also feels extremely relatable, right? We've lived in this time now, I think, where we have seen so many like broad cultural revolutions happening with gender and gender identity and conversations about race and sexuality and all these different things, even class and capitalism, coinciding with a moment of like extreme repression and like conservative backlash. It's like, obviously those two things are tied. But in the 80s, when these conversations come up again, of course, the legal reaction to that is extremely notable and is going to kind of form a touchstone for where we're going to talk about from the rest of this series. So I'm going to read an op-ed in the New York Times, a short one. I'm only going to read a brief clipping of it, but I want to kind of talk about this as a framework for understanding how pop stars specifically were figureheads culturally for changing conversations about race in America. And obviously it's the New York Times, so take this with a grain of salt, right? Like, I'm not saying America was suddenly extremely friendly to all people or extremely progressive.
Absolutely not.
But the conversation was changing culturally at the cultural level. I'm not talking about at the institutional or state levels. So this is from December 2nd, 1981.
This is crazy to read, honestly.
I know. It's crazy to read. And again, guys, we're reading directly from something in 1981. So just take that with a grain of salt that this is not our own words.
I didn't even know these terms existed.
December 2nd, 1981, an op-ed runs in the Pop Life vertical of the New York Times, which was a vertical they were running in 1981. Quote, "Is Prince leading music to a true biracism?" And by more modern terms, what they're trying to explain there is biraciality or multiculturalism.
Or like
yes. So this is directly from the New York Times at the time. And finding this on the internet was difficult, but shout out to libraries. Prince, the 21-year-old singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist who is performing tonight at the Palladium. And think about that, by the way.
I know, right?
1981, 21. Prince is 21. This is pre-Prince fever. This is like the very
before everything changed.
early years of Prince, before no one knew who he was.
We're like just recovering from the Beatles.
Yes.
And the Stones. Like
Prince, the 21-year-old singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist who is performing tonight at the Palladium, is the most controversial contemporary rock star precisely because he challenges most sexual and racial stereotypes. The songs on his 4 Warner Bros. Albums explore adolescent sexuality and language explicit enough to require warning stickers, contains language which may be unsuitable for certain listeners, but the stickers haven't kept his records off the bestseller charts. And his music confounds racial categories by combining elements of white pop and rock with black dance rhythms.
it's crazy that at this point in literally 1981, we're still segregating music in this way.
Yes. How rigid are racial categories in contemporary pop music? Prince recently found out when the Rolling Stones invited him to open several West Coast concerts on their 1981 tour. And I had not known about this.
I had no idea either.
The suggestions of androgyny in his fluid body movements and flamboyantly minimal stage costume were more than a little reminiscent of some of Mick Jagger's early performances. But the almost entirely white Stones audience apparently failed to make the connection. They pelted Prince with fruit and bottles, causing him to cut his sets short. Similar reactions from white radio programmers have kept Prince's records off of most FM rock stations. It's the stations with black music formats that are playing them. The fact that Prince can do everything makes him one of the most impressive new pop talents of the past year. It's also the secret behind his apparently effortless fusion of black and white pop styles. The music transcends racial stereotyping precisely because it's almost all Prince. Prince himself transcends racial stereotyping because, as he once puts it, I never grew up in one particular culture. One suspects that as time goes on, more and more of American pop will reflect a similarly biracial orientation. If that's so, Prince's black and white synthesis isn't just a picture of what could be, it's a prophecy.
Well, you know what? Some parts are true. I cannot get over. I mean, they really pointed out directly.
Prince. They pelted Prince
as Ashlyn
off stage.
As Ashlyn is saying in the chat right now, these people are in hell because some of them are still alive. They're going to hell still.
Prince.
Talk about being on the wrong side of history. But I do love that they even call it in this article, like at the time they're aware of this, that the, like, as they say here, quote, fluid body movements and flamboyantly minimal stage costume were more than a little reminiscent of some of Mick Jagger's early performances, but the almost entirely white Stones audiences apparently failed to make the connection. We still have this today in music and art discourse all the time, where you have a white artist and a black artist doing objectively the same material or subjectively even the same material, and one is judged horribly for
I mean, we can confidently
over the coals for doing the same
say
thing.
that outside of like things obviously about Sam Smith's body that the culture has latched onto,
right?
People, whatever people have said about Sam Smith and Kim Petras, they said infinitely worse things to Lil Nas X about Montero.
Oh my God.
Categorically,
absolutely.
infinitely worse things about Lil Nas X.
Absolutely.
And again, same themes, same kind of thing. And you could even say Montero was like more artistically progressive in many ways.
Right.
And still like if you go back and you look at the reaction to that, it was unlike anything at the
You
time.
would think they were like conjuring Satan, but
No, literally. Okay. So then we're going to read one more article from the New York Times
I
a
could
few
read this
years
piece if you
later.
don't mind.
Yes.
'Cause I love- this
This
one
is
is really
why
interesting.
these pop singers have risen to superstardom from September 2nd, 1984 in the New York Times. And we're jumping forward a little bit in the 1980s only because I wanted to contrast these two articles back to back because, again, we see pop music can change very quickly. It could change very quickly back then, even though mass media was slower, and it can change very quickly now. So with just 4 years between them, how do things change? Why don't you read this?
yeah, this one really threw me through a loop. Also, like, I think they get into a little bit, but this really is a good example of why the 80s was like the generation of the teenager and how that really changed culture, because how much happens in the last few years is wild. So again, quoting directly from the New York Times op-ed, fascination with Prince and Michael Jackson, of course, is hardly limited to teenage fan magazines, or for that matter, to rock press. Mr. Jackson's latest album, Thriller, broke practically every record in the music business. According to Epic Records, 37 million copies have already been sold, and the singer has ascended to that rarefied firmament of superstars. He's invited to the White House and denounced by the Soviet Union. Courted by filmmakers and politicians, his every move and utterance relentlessly studied. Students petition their school boards for the right to wear copies of his white gloves to class. The editorials in The Nation and The New Republic analyze the social implications of his fame. Prince has yet to achieve such mass appeal. But since Purple Rain went to the top of the record and movie charts last month, the Minneapolis-born singer has been certified as one of the hottest phenomenon of the summer. At first glance, the two singers look like a perfectly matched pair of alter egos. Both mix black and white idioms in their music, and both have shattered race barriers in the record business. Both are recluses who refuse to do interviews, and both play coy with the conventional racial and sexual definitions. As Prince slyly sings in Controversy, "Am I black or white? Am I straight or gay? What was it that you wanted me to be?" While both singers transcend traditional stereotypes, they also project radically different images. Like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, Elvis Presley and Pat Boone, Prince and Michael Jackson stand at two poles. The first, insidious, threatening, and darkly sexual. The second, more sunnily upbeat and wholesome. What exactly accounts for their phenomenal popularity? In many respects, Prince and Michael Jackson have a lot in common with their celebrated predecessors. All appeal to teenagers by mixing sex and innocent in a variable equation, and all flirt with the idea of rebellion. Even the notion of androgyny is nothing new. While social critics have recently heralded Mr. Jackson and Prince, along with Boy George and Annie Lennox, as harbingers of another sexual revolution, similar charges were once brought against Elvis. Quote, effeminate, sneered parents, and the Beatles, similarly they quoted soft, girlish, Mick Jagger, girlishly virile, said Newsweek, and David Bowie, they even have a quote here, faggy, said Playboy.
And I want to just quote this really quick, stop this quote really quick to also point out that, you know, one thing that we talk about a lot in this podcast and have talked about a lot, but also just culture has talked about a lot, and many Black scholars and artists and just cultural figureheads have pointed this out well before any of us were hip to it, that Elvis Presley and people like Mick Jagger and all these people obscured the extremely and inherently Black origins of rock music, R&B, and pop music in America.
They weren't even reckoning with it at this point.
Yeah, I know. And that's something that we deal with in modern times too, right? Like it was something that came up during the Elvis movie press tour. Go listen to our Patreon episode to hear what's going on with his accent. But so what I'm saying is, like, it's just interesting to read something at the time in the 80s when these people were still at the height of their popularity and at like really the apex of their careers, to hear someone just completely rewrite history to be like, oh, well, they're like these other people who are, by the way, all white and cribbed their styles from Black artists in the 50s and 60s, and especially just the wholesale removal of disco as any sort of cultural touchstone or iconography in this article, right? Like, Mick Jagger was not the only guy playing with sexual gender stereotypes in the 1970s. Like, literally Sylvester was right there. Like all of the people who listen to Donna Summer's music were right there. Like I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's absolutely important context, honestly. Absolutely. So this is kind of the end of it here. In fact, every few years, a performer comes along who inspires mass adulation, and each time, psychologists and sociologists attempt to explicate their appeal. Back in the 40s, I love this part here. Back in the 40s, experts came up with a host of theories to explain Frank Sinatra's devastating effect on young women. They argued that these unfortunate Bobby Soxers, which I'll explain that in a minute, were simply reacting to the wartime lack of young men, and that they were victims of mass hypnotism, that they harbored latent maternal feelings for the skinny singer. A decade later, when Elvis Presley emerged as the heartthrob of the day, they argued that the hip-grinding singer had articulated that sexuality seething beneath the 50s prim and proper surface, that as a poor boy who'd made it, he symbolized the vitality of the American dream. And when the Beatles came along in '63, they argued that Beatlemania was a response to the grief of the Kennedy assassination, and that the Fab Four success was a reflection of a newly affluent society's need for fun. So Bobby Soxers, never heard that term in my life.
Oh, you haven't?
Actually explains everything. No, I don't know how I haven't heard this. So Bobby Soxers is obviously kind of an older term now for the wildly enthusiastic adolescent female fans of 1940s pop music, particularly Frank Sinatra. Bobby Soxers were usually teenage
Ashton
girls.
says there's a movie, which is
that explains it, why it sounds familiar. Okay, yeah, Bobby Soxers were usually teenage girls in high schools and colleges who got the names from the popular Bobby socks that they wore. As a teenager, actress Shirley Temple played, the Bobby Soxer in the film Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer.
Yeah.
And just Google Bobby Soxers, you'll see exactly the kind of look that we're talking about in aesthetic.
And so again, I wanted to contrast these two articles because it's a really interesting place to touch on, right? So we see in the 50s, like Black music get formally recognized in America. I'm not saying that it was celebrated or that it experienced like widespread popularity and the artists were taken care of and had all the success of the white artists that stole their music and sounds. I'm just saying like the literal R&B chart was invented in the 1950s. So we see this happen, right? Specifically, a lot of it coming out of Chicago in Chicago blues with Chess Records. You have these R&B artists literally like pioneering radio stations, even playing Black music at all and R&B at all. And then you see this go up through the 60s. You see all the girl groups, especially like Black girl groups like the Supremes. You see the Temptations in the 70s. You have disco music happen. And, there is sudden cultural prominence of Black cultural figures that are not necessarily political leaders or activists or writers and whatnot, or, just people that are in the news, but like people that are making music and making art and writing books and stuff, and actually having that art be disseminated. So to see where those attitudes then started to coincide with what you could see as integration into society or into mass culture up into the 80s, and to see how people were like grappling with the idea that there was a pop star who was popular enough to quote unquote mix Black and white styles is fascinating to us, but also I think something that we see now in music as well in this particular era of music. And I am in no way comparing one-to-one what was going on in the 70s and 80s to like 2023, but we're kind of seeing it with people like Harry Styles and Sam Smith and Kim Petras. And of course, the underpinning here is that they are all white, but even people like Lil Nas X, where they are bringing queer culture. And I'm not saying I like what Harry Styles is doing. You can go listen to my episode of Gender Reveal all about Harry Styles. But like just more specifically, you can see that kind of happening now, right? And we can draw a parallel to people having to grapple with like cultural commentators who aren't up on queer culture, having to grapple with like, oh, like a trans girl and a non-binary person like did a performance at the Grammys, and like now we all have to deal with it and grapple with it and write about it and do all of our stupid liberal like op-eds about what it means for society, right?
Oh, this is hilarious reading New York Times op-eds from the 80s and being like, well, it only got worse. Like,
at least it's consistent.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to read another link here that we have in our notes. It is The Birth of the PMRC by Claude Chastanger, who is a European historian. He specifically studies music history in the United States and also through the lens of Europe. And we have it linked here on Hal Science in our notes, and I'm going to be reading this for you all. But I do just want to like really quickly just say this one line that he has in this PDF, which is why ultimately I'm citing him, because I was like, okay, I see you, Claude, I see you. He says, quote, "There is a tendency in Europe to consider with condescension the numerous and recurring assaults on freedom of expression in the United States." And I was like, I see here.
Yeah.
Until recently, many Europeans, and I for one, felt confident that such a situation could not develop to the same extent in their countries. So anyways, I know. I just was like, when I read that, I was like, okay, so maybe you're not a total dumbass. So this comes to us a little bit later on. This was published in France in the specific year, I believe it was in the 90s, but let me just triple check for you. Yes, 1999. So this is from his section of this research paper called The Birth of the PMRC. So we're going to get into what that all is. You're all like, what the fuck? Where are we now? We're just talking about Michael Jackson. We're just talking about Prince. You're going to see. Trust me. I'm leading you on a journey. I promise you I haven't led you astray yet. So this is where things start to get tied together, and you kind of are going to start to see where we're going with this episode. So in the early 1980s, and I'm reading directly from Claude, the National Parent-Teacher Association, a 5.4 million member American organization, incensed by the lyrics of some rock songs, particularly the line, "I sincerely want to fuck the taste out of your mouth" in Let's Pretend We're Married by Prince, suggested to us a symbol on some records to warn prospective buyers of their context. Remember, they were mad about Prince. Okay. It publicized its proposal by a series of letters sent to influential personalities. A certain Susan Baker was among the addressees. She listened carefully to other songs, notably Prince's Darling Nikki, Sugar Walls by Sheena Easton, and Eat Me Alive by Judas Priest, and what followed was the setting up of the most formidable censorship machine in American popular music. For Susan Baker was the wife of Secretary of the Treasury James A. Baker III. With a few friends, all married to heavyweight politicians, like Peetsy Hollings, wife of Senator Ernest Hollings, Ethel Ann Stuckey, married to William Stuckey, a former Georgia congressman, Sally Nevius, whose husband John Nevius was a member of the Washington City Council, Tipper Gore, wife of Al Gore, at the time Senator of Tennessee, now Vice President, and Pam Hauer, President of CEO of the major Washington construction firm. Remember, this was 1999, in case you're like, wait, Al Gore is not Vice President. She decided, we're talking about specifically Susan A. Baker, to create an organization in order to inform parents about the pornographic content of some rock songs. In May 1985, the PMRC, or Parents Music Resource Center, was born. Its board of directors constituted another of 17 Washington wives, married to senators, congressmen, and cabinet officials, along with a couple of businessmen, spouses, and an advisory board where one could find Joseph Stussy, a professor of music at the University of Texas, the Honorable Andrew Young, the mayor of Atlanta, or TV host Sheila Walsh. The PMRC was founded with the financial help of Mike Love from the Beach Boys and of Joseph Coors, the owner of Coors Beers.
Love it.
Did you also hear that, by the way? The Beach Boys. Okay.
Which is
both had actively supported Reagan's candidacy, and Coors offered offices to the PMRC. A minister from Virginia, Reverend Jeff Ling, famous for his slideshows denouncing sex and violence and rock and roll, was enrolled to write the abundant literature the PMRC intended to publish. Several religious organizations offered their logistical support. Teen Vision from Pittsburgh, Pat Robertson's 700 Club, and the Religious Booksellers Convention, which distributed Tipper Gore's book, Raising PG Kids in an X-Rated Society, though the PMRC denied any ideological connection with these groups. Doesn't sound like anything that happens today.
I have a feeling that that book, Raging PG Kids in an X-Rated Society, really holds up today, I'm sure.
So we're going to just end it here by saying the PMRC's goals were clearly defined: to educate and inform parents of this alarming new trend towards lyrics that are sexually explicit. Such information and education relied on a stricter enforcement of obscenity laws obscenity laws and on a less permissive attitude. Susan Baker called it, quote, self-restraint. From record companies, the PMRC thus rejected the accusation of censorship. Quote, Balenciaga, pornography sold to children is illegal. Enforcing that is not censorship. It is simply the act of a responsible society that recognizes some material made available to adults is not appropriate for children. Its purpose was to show the causal link between rock music and social problems such as an increase in rape, teenage suicide, or teen pregnancies. Quote, it is with our intention that pervasive messages aimed at children which promote and glorify suicide, rape, and sadomasochism have to be numbered among the contributing factors. As Loris Grossberg puts it, quote, the PMRC aimed at reasserting control over the cultural environment of children. The moral fabric of the United States, its personal and family values had to be rescued through the regulation of youth's cultural consumption. Dun, dun, dun. Wow. Not applicable to anything we've ever talked about here on this podcast.
Time is definitely not a circle, and it's definitely not rotating constantly.
Now, you were reading these notes, obviously, and I'm sure you were like, there's a lot of things happening. And then I'm sure you read this and you're like, I see where she's going with all of this.
Absolutely.
I love when my brain works well. So I'm
Shout
now
out to your brain.
going to read... I'm not even joking, legitimately the worst thing any of you are ever going to hear in literally your entire lives. Like,
no.
I straight up cannot stress enough that what is about to happen to your ears is going to change your life forever. Okay.
By the way, can I just say really, really, really quickly, I did have to look up if this book is still available, and you can still purchase on Amazon, The Raging Peachy Kids and the X-Ray Society. Most recent review from 2020, just terrible, 1 star. Tipper Gore is an embarrassment. I'm eternally glad that people like her did not win out culturally in the long term. The book now reads like a relic of a laughable moral panic. Wow. Amazing.
Well, 2020. Well, 2020.
No, you can just look at it.
Wait, what day in 2020?
April 9th.
Oh, so this
really
was
going through it.
This was like early pandemiana. Mama, you got a big storm coming. April
I love
9th,
the people
2020.
Oh, never mind. I should have to read these reviews, but
Yeah, you shouldn't.
it's fun to see the quick decline. Anyway, continue.
Yeah. Okay. So what we are about to read now is the exact name when I got this from the University of California, Riverside's library on the Senate. Quote, notes from a record labeling hearing before the Committee on Commerce, Science, Transportation, United States Senate 99th Congress, first session on contents of music and the lyrics of records, September 19th, 1985.
Yeah, this is where it really gets bad.
Yes.
Like, really bad.
So this is a Senate hearing that the PMRC we're talking is like a few months old. If we want to talk about how quickly, like, this is really, I think, something...
Washington wives, as they were saying.
Yes, so this is something that's really key here, right? One thing that we confront, and we confronted this in Balenciaga too, right? The idea of the vocal minority, right? These people who truly do not account for the majority of people in America,
yes, of course,
but who are loudest and most generally the people with the power or the proximity
or the
to power.
financial resources as well.
Yes, we're talking Coors Light, we're talking Beach Boys, we're not even talking about that. We're talking about the literal future Second Lady of the United States. So we're going to read from this, and we have linked the entire Senate hearing, which is like 165 pages, in the notes to this episode. But if you want to follow along, we are going to be reading through pages 2 and 4. So first, these are going to be the opening statements by Senator Hollings and Senator Al Gore. Remember, Al Gore was just a little old senator before he invented climate change and the internet. And this is what he had to say. So I'm going to read Senator Hollings' opening statement in support of the PMRC. Remember, these are the people who sponsored this hearing and have brought it before Congress and are campaigning on behalf of the PMRC and, in Al Gore's case, his literal wife. And the fact that you can literally just bring your wife in front of Congress to change the laws of the country is wild. So,
not a conflict of interest at all.
This is from Senator Hollings, 1985. Quote, Mr. Chairman,
I want to commend the Parent Music Resource Center for bringing this to the nation's attention. I have the opportunity to attend a showing, you might say, or presentation of this porn rock, as they call it. In the test of pornography, one of the things to look at is whether or not it has any redeeming social value.
Yeah, that's why you're looking at it.
Remember what we were talking about with Roth versus the United States, the idea of redeeming social value or offensive to cultural standards. Okay.
Or even all the way to the Daily Beast now, redeeming social value. Morality needs to be taught.
There could be an exception here because having attended that presentation, the redeeming social value that I find is inaudible. I have a hard time understanding it. Paul, since I have traveled the country for 3 years, they said they could not understand me. Maybe I could make a good rock star. I do not know. But in all candor, I would tell you it is outrageous filth, and we have got to do something about it. This is Congress, by the way.
It's insane.
I take the tempered approach of our distinguished chairman, and I commend it. Yet, I would make the statement that if I could find some way constitutionally to do away with it, I would. I noticed on the media yesterday something about a tax bill. I have looked into that. That does not seem to pertain to this particular hearing, but we do know that the broadcast airwaves give more or less the most limited of protected speech, because the airwaves do not belong to the American public. They invade the privacy of the home. Oh, because the airwaves do belong to the American public. Excuse me. They invade the privacy of the homes. We do know under the law of pornography that children are given a special protection. I want everyone to know I am keeping that foremost in mind, and I am asking the best of constitutional minds if there is some way in the world to try and limit it as we go with this voluntary labeling. I commend those who are now beginning to label. That is what we would like to have. Truth in labeling.
Oh my God.
But I do not think we can outlaw pornography. I do not have that in mind at all. But take 6 or 7 hours daily, the average listening time. Senator, as I understand, by the youngsters of this particular porn rock and rock music and everything else of that kind, well, let us say rock music and intersperse it with some pornography. This is a matter of national concern, and it is something that we have to give It's something that we have got to give some kind of attention to within the constriction of free speech.
Dude, you actually sprinkle porn into your music? Always spilled the pornography.
No, he's like, guys, they're listening to like 6 or 7 hours of music a day and just sprinkle in some porn there.
So
I will be looking from the senator's standpoint, not just to bring pressures to try to see if there is some constitutional provisions to tax, but an approach that can be used by Congress to limit this outrageous filth, suggestive violence, suicide, and everything else in the Lord's word that you would not think of. Certainly the writers and framers of our First Amendment never, cancel culture.
Stop.
Certainly the writers and framers of our First Amendment never perhaps heard this music in their time.
I love how it's like pausing, like maybe, never perhaps.
Considered the podcast airwaves.
Stop.
And certainly that being piped into people's homes willy-nilly over the air. I will be listening closely.
It's like the drama. He was like, watch me work. Like,
he's like,
I'm about to do a presentation.
George Washington and Benjamin Button did not account for the idea that they would beam porn into the home over the airwaves.
Just wait till they hear WAP, honestly. Like,
okay.
Wait till we get to
I
WAP.
am sorry. We also have another defense. So this is my favorite part, and it's my favorite because I have a sick sense of humor. I am sorry. We also have another defense appropriations markup that I must leave here shortly, but I will be in and out. It is not because I am not interested. I am very interested in trying to our level best to limit and control as best we can for the tender young ears of America, the porn rock that will be presented here. I have heard some of it, and I am sure you have.
It's A performance. A performance,
mama.
It's crazy.
Outrageous filth. Now, Senator Tribble does have one thing to say that I do think is very interesting.
This is about Plato.
If only that this is about Plato.
Yeah, we kind of have to, honestly.
Senator Tribble opens, quote, Mr. Chairman, a brief statement, if I may. More than 2,300 years ago, Plato recognized that music is a powerful force in our lives, that music forms character and therefore plays an important part in determining social and political issues. In Plato's words, when modes of music change, the fundamental laws of the state change with them.
So true.
Perhaps Daniel O'Connell, the 18th century Irish nationalist, expressed it best when he said, quote, let me write the songs of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws. Our culture powerfully affects individual character. When we are constantly confronted by that which is coarse, we are coarsened. Repeated exposure to song lyrics describing rape, incest, sexual violence, and perversion is like sandpaper to the soul. It rubs raw one's sensibilities. It results in a state of emotional numbness. And in the words of George Will, one becomes literally demoralized. Now, the subject of suggestive lyrics on a child may not be cataclysmic. Rather, the emotional damage is more subtle. The effect on a troubled child, however, can be disastrous, pushing that child over the emotional precipice, and to the extent that individual attitudes are influenced, this becomes a very real social problem. But have you considered Plato, Mr. Michael Jackson? Okay. Last, we're going to read Mr. Gore. Mr. Al Gore with his rhythms on the internet. Now, this one is my favorite. Wife guy alert. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank and commend you for calling this hearing. Because my wife has been heavily involved in the evolution of this issue, I have gained quite a bit of familiarity with it, and I have really gained an education in what is involved. The two most important things I have learned, which have changed my initial attitude to this whole concern, are, number one, the proposals made by those concerned about this problem do not involve a government role of any kind whatsoever. They are not asking for any form of censorship or regulation of speech in any manner, shape, or form. What they are asking for is whether the music industry can show some self-restraint in working together in a manner similar to that which is used by the movie industry, whether or not they are. There is no question about the message. I still hear art is art, and in America, artists are supposed to be free to regulate themselves. But who has the responsibility to regulate? Parents, the music industry, the government? I speak as a legislator. I speak as a parent, a veteran who has brought 3 children through adolescence. I know the temptations dangled in front of teenagers. I know the frustrations parents experience all through this process. The sense of hopelessness when you get the feeling your child will not listen to you. There is, in these times, an often need to look for a force outside yourself for help. The question we must ask is, should the force be the government? And that is what this hearing is designed to determine. I believe it will be helpful before we proceed any further to get an idea of what it is we are talking about. One criticism of the rock industry is the way it portrays values in rock videos which are viewed by kids. These are suggestions that move to label rock albums be extended to videos as well. I do not watch much television. I am not sure how many of my colleagues get the opportunity to watch any of the music video shows now available on cable and free TV. I brought 2 videos from which I believe are representative of the kind of presentations which caused the problem. The first is by the group Van Halen for the movie Hot for Teacher.
Oh my God. I had to watch that after reading this part. And it's again, it's always crazy to see, relatively speaking, what people thought was so obscene.
Now, this is a very large crowd today. We have allowed people in beyond the capacity of this room. We are not going to have any kind of demonstration, no applause, no demonstration of that kind.
They don't want someone going slay when they watch the video.
Yeah. Now, then he goes on to thank the chairman, thank everyone, etc., etc. Plays clips. He pulls up YouTube. And he's like, guys, we're going to listen to Hot for Teacher by Van Halen. No, it's really interesting listening to this, but I want to just ask, what stands out to you in this? Because I'm curious to hear what really affected you.
I think what's the most upsetting is that thing we're still seeing today that we've been talking about ad nauseum on this podcast, where like to discuss an act of violence is to like endorse it, engage with it, and be tempted. And it's like the Protestant values of like the devil will lead you down the wrong path is like this is what all of it's about. It's all about fear of damnation, fear of going to hell, and fear of corrupting the children. But I still cannot perceive what they think is going to happen to the children, or like what is going to happen when people are exposed to this. It's like, I mean, I guess I can assume at the same time, and I apply it to what I've seen probably in my own childhood with like, which we'll get to in the 2000s. But it just seems like wild to me that people can't be honest with their children or talk to them about these subjects. They simply just can't engage in it. It can't be something you enjoy or like or talk about or engage in. We can't have a discussion about it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And
viewership.
you know, the broader thing here, which we will get into later, about cancel culture in the 80s.
Because this is what this is all about, let's be honest.
Is about, you know, the need for the religious right to say you are censoring our speech. You are censoring our ability to, you know, make like hateful movies and hateful comedy routines and like publish books with hateful messages. But also we need to censor the other stuff.
And it's crazy at the same time, and this is still happening now, but especially in the 80s, people are the KKK is still like actively marching on the streets, and people who don't even agree with them they allegedly don't agree with them, because I have something to say about that, fight for that protection. Oh, they should be able to say this. They should be able to march and do that.
Yes.
But we can't have a song called Hot for Teacher where a woman in a swimsuit dances in
it's
front of a bunch
okay
of
for the
children.
KKK to march through the streets where literally everyone can see.
Wild. And I know
But
that's the same people
It's
here.
not okay for Frank Zappa to sing "I'm Hot for Teacher." He's not in Van Halen. Is Frank Zappa in Van Halen? I don't think so. It
doesn't even matter.
But like, he was one of the people
just
sued by the
crazy.
PMRC. Like gone after. I know. Like Ashlyn is going crazy about me not knowing who Frank Zappa is. I'm so sorry.
Time to get dragged.
So sorry.
Dragged for Philip.
So sorry. I'm like so sorry, everybody. What a bad man I am.
It's crazy. Though,
is he
honestly.
just Frank Zappa? He wasn't in anything. Okay, sorry about that, everybody.
Don't expose yourself like this.
Sorry. I did all this research and I forgot I mixed up who Frank Zappa was. Apologies. Anyways, no, it's totally true what you're saying though, and it's like again what Tipper Gore and all of these people have said in the time since is like we're proud of what we did, and like. If this is not clear, what they have done is successfully label for the creation of the explicit label. And ultimately down the line, the ability for companies to produce albums that are explicit and then scrub them and make clean versions for the radio's music performances, that sort of thing. This little red tag on Apple Music that says explicit, you can thank Tipper Gore for that. And all those people who literally had mental breakdowns over accidentally listening to the non-explicit version of Renaissance for the entire summer, you can also blame Tipper Gore for that as well.
Oh my God. I think what's also, okay, I do take a part of it back of what I'm afraid of, what these people are afraid of. They're not really saying it in some of the things we have here, but we do have to remember that like the 70s, 80s was like a height of like the cult scare and obviously the Red Scare and all the conflating
and we'll
things
get into
going on
that
with
next week.
I'm sure we will. But I can see why there's that fear. But again, the lack of engagement or the idea that someone will just fall down a like pit of despair and they're unrecoverable.
Well, I think
it just fits so
what I
many
think
of
is
the
interesting
horrid
is
views people
what I think
have.
is interesting is the PMRC is not immediately calling up upon the Satanic Panic.
Yeah.
They're not like intimately resurrecting the players in the Satanic Panic, but what it shows is the ability of the religious right to have its message sanitized by the people in power in this country and then passed off as law and passed off as legislation.
Absolutely.
You know, Tipper Gore's not going in front of Congress and being like, the devil is going to make our children kill each other. But that is the broader cultural force at play, and she doesn't have to say that because the entire country was whipped up into a fervor about whether or not schools were allegedly secretly sacrificing children to Satan in basements under the schools. Like,
but we'll get there.
We'll get there. Now, This is from the Harvard Crimson in 1985, November 6, 1985. This is just the first primary source I could find about this hearing. I doubt the Harvard Crimson was like the only people to cover it, but this was just the most immediately available source I could link for all of you. So let's go with it. Zappa defends obscene lyrics. Yeah. Frank Zappa, famously not in Van Halen.
Don't bring that up. They're going to drag you.
Hot for teacher.
Clad in unusually conservative attire, offbeat rock musician Frank Zappa last night attacked a parents group which is fighting obscenity in popular music. Zappa, before more than 500 at the Kennedy School of Government, spoke out against the recent agreement between the Record Industry Association of America and an influential parent group to label offensive records with warning stickers or to print the lyrics on the album jacket. He called the parents movement a, quote, hysteria campaign and said that record companies, not the parent group, would determine what is obscene. Zappa said the labels would not prevent anyone from buying records. His opponent, Sally Nevius, founder of the PMRC, argued that listening to obscene lyrics can be, quote, extremely damaging to adolescents in the formative years because many teenagers view rock musicians as role models. She also said that parents need a tool in determining what their children should and should not listen to. Under the terms of the compromise with the PMRC, which included several congressional wives, one half of the record industry's 44 companies, agreed to either place a parental advisory warning label on records with lyrics describing, quote, explicit sex violence or substance abuse, or to print the lyrics on the album jacket.
And before we get into this next piece from the Washington Post a little bit earlier that year, I want to thread what was happening with blues music in the 1950s in both Chicago and like broader, more cultural panics about blues and black musicians being played on the airwaves. One of the things that we read in both the Louder Sounds piece as well as Black Musicians in the White City was this fear that music made by black people was going to, incite moral panic and incite bad behavior and sexual wantonness in children. And specifically, like, the beats of the music itself were sexual, right? That
the rapid, seductive beats.
You could literally take away all the lyrics and the music itself was still sexual and obscene. And we know for a fact that rock music appropriated blues and R&B in the 50s and appropriated the work of black musicians.
Yep.
And part of this underpinning of the moral panic about rock music is a broader panic about black people integrating into American society and pop stars like Prince and Michael Jackson integrating into the music industry in spaces that were once exclusively gatekept by white musicians, which is why in both the PMRC's first official hearing before Congress, as well as its early years and the songs that they specifically cited as their origin story, their Joker origin story, if you will, were Prince.
It's crazy.
And so I just wanted to once again thread that line for us so we didn't lose it in the PMRC stuff, because this is quite a bit of long episode we're delivering to you for the first one. And I just want to make sure that that doesn't get lost. So next we have this Washington Post piece from a few months prior in August 29th, 1985. Do you want to read this one for me too?
Yeah. So, reacting to pressure from several parents groups decrying pop lyrics glorifying sex, drugs, violence, and occultism, 19 companies that represent 80% of record and tape sales agreed in early August to print the warning, quote, parental guidance, explicit lyrics. Quote, but that language developed by the Recording Industry Association of America isn't strong enough for the 5.6 million member National Conference of Parents and Teachers, the PTA, and the PMRC. PMRC is still pushing for an industry/consumer panel to develop guidelines to ensure uniformity in the application of the warning. I informed them that that was not possible, said RIAA President Stanley Gortkopf, calling the warning a good faith approach toward the PMRC's concerns. He says also, quote, first of all, explicit is explicit. It's impossible to come up with such guidelines because lyrics deal with interpretation and characterization. It isn't just a list of 4-letter words. And this could be a step towards a censorship mode, which I'm not comfortable with.
So then the RIAA's Director of National Public Relations says that warnings could begin appearing at the time in the next few months. Record labels were unavailable or declined to comment on this story, I think because they were still trying to figure out whether or not there could be any kind of governmental or legal repercussions to them failing to comply with these new standards and suggestions, which again, there was not an act in favor of this, right? Nothing was voted on. This was a suggestion that received no governmental oversight and was the government just asking record companies to self-censor. And so that is why I'm sure at the time in August 29th, 1985, these record companies were like, we'll get back to you on that, right? Because they don't want to maybe piss off the government or bring down official censorship from the government. Tipper Gore added that while a film's X rating is meant to limit its audience, what couldn't be true with records. There is no restrictions whatsoever on who could purchase records, she said. Tipper Gore also emphasized that the group is not promoting censorship. Quote, we at the PMRC would in fact be against censorship. We're talking about a consumer tool, a consumer label. I don't want to dictate to anybody, and that's not the purpose of our group. What's happened to me personally and to others and why we're so motivated is that we have kids who are preteens that are attracted to the music, as well they should be, and go and buy an album and get more than they bargained for. So this is like a huge like internal debate within record companies. There's people like Tipper and people within the PMRC who even campaign for like full covers to the music itself. So like a rapper,
like a Kids Bop version.
No, like a rapper.
Oh,
around the CD.
Oh, like truly like a full like just censorship bar almost over the whole album.
You couldn't even see the album cover.
Wow.
That like explicit albums were like explicitly wrapped in some sort of protective shield that so you couldn't even see it.
That is crazy because it's like especially at that time, how are you supposed to even know what you're buying?
Yes. And this Washington Post piece from 1985 also says that records with some of the issues that they were grappling with were whether records with explicit covers be wrapped or kept under the counter, whether they could reassess contracts with performers who engaged in violent or sexual acts on stage, broadcasters being pressured to exhibit voluntary restraint by not airing offensive music videos, which would also be rated. So this was affecting everyone. It was affecting record companies. It was affecting MTV, not MTV specifically, but like the channels that were showcasing these music videos. It was affecting the nightly news, whether they could cover these music videos. It was affecting artists' contracts. They were now suddenly thinking oh, fuck, because I sing about sex and drugs, is my record label going to cut me off because they don't want to deal with the losses? And again, I hate to be the smartest person in the room. Could you see maybe why Sam Smith's performance at the Grammys might have been a big deal since Blind Items came out saying that their company that put this on for them, the record label, didn't want them to do it in the first place because it might have backlash, and that there's all these now like, oh, is Sam Smith and Kim Petras going to lose their record contracts? Are they going to have some kind of violation fine placed on them by the broadcasters, similar to what happened with Janet Jackson in the Super Bowl? Like,
wait till we get to that as well.
So we're going to end with a few different things. So I want to read to you this piece in the New York Times. Madonna's new beat is a hit, but song's message wrinkles. Now, this is going to get covered more extensively in our episode about the 90s because Madonna's career really kind of strikes out in the 90s. Strikes out in a good way. And that's a bad way to say it. She hits a home run in the 90s.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But the origins of like her controversial public image are found in the 80s.
Yes.
Papa don't preach, I'm in deep trouble. Papa don't preach, I've been losing sleep. But I made up my mind, I'm keeping my baby. Later that day, she took part in a sexuality rap session at an adolescent services center in Manhattan, the door at 618 Avenue at Americas at 18th Street. When a social worker leading the group mentioned Papa Don't Preach, Kathy Peters shook her head and said, "Too many kids are getting pregnant. They don't know what they're getting into. I don't like the message." But, she added with a smile, "I do like the beat." Many young people like the beat. The song is the second single from Madonna's third album, True Blue, currently one of the best-selling records in the United States. In the popular video, the rock star portrays a pregnant teenager who begs her father to bless her decision to keep the baby. As its popularity has increased, so has criticism and support the song has received from groups concerned with pregnancy and abortion. The message, said the executive producer of Planned Parenthood of New York City, Alfred Morin, is that getting pregnant is cool and having the baby is the right thing and a good thing, and don't listen to your parents, the school, anyone who tells you otherwise. Don't preach to me, Papa. The reality is that what Madonna is suggesting to teenagers is a path to permanent poverty. However, groups opposed to abortion see Papa Don't Preach as a positive pro-life song. Quote, "Abortion is readily available on every street corner for women," said the president of the California chapter of Feminists for Life in America, Susan Carpenter McMillian. Now what Madonna is telling them is, hey, there's an alternative. Lace gloves and rosaries. Mr. Morin remembers how his agency's clinics were filled last year with girls wearing fingerless lace gloves and rosaries around their neck in imitation of Madonna's fashion styles. Now,
So wild.
this is an interesting article, but I include it because we, at the time, again, backlash towards music goes both directions, right? It wasn't just people on the right having opinions about music. People like Planned Parenthood were also having opinions about music, about people that we now see as, at the time, progressive musical figures like Madonna, right? And I just think it's like this interesting juxtaposition, and I think it would be bad of us to not provide a little bit of juxtaposition, which is also why I'm including this next Washington Post op-ed, Unrest in the Purple Kingdom, from April 12th, 1987, from the Washington Post, because it again provides a little more cultural commentary about Prince's legacy in the 80s at the time. And again, I'm doing this a little bit for flavor, one, but also because I think it's important to provide a little juxtaposition that it wasn't just the PMRC that was mad about music. It wasn't like everyone in America was single-handedly in arms about guilty rock music making kids bad. That there were writers and there were readers and listeners who were also critically engaging in music and seriously grappling with its consequences in society and also just what it stood for in general. And again, I think it's really interesting to be able to read something from 1987 and recognize parts of our modern life in it and just things that we think about still. So this is from 1987, Unrest in the Purple Kingdom. It's an article detailing Prince's proteges out of Minneapolis and people like Sheena Easton and just different people that Prince mentored that were in Prince's orbit and just coming up through the Prince like extended scene in this era when, and this is a little later in the piece, you can read the full one if you go to the link in our notes. Quote, "In this era, when the denial of pleasure is proposed as the answer to every social problem, an effective advocacy of sexual liberation would be most welcome. Unfortunately, Prince seems unwilling, while his followers, Escovedo, Simone, Jesse John, and Morris Day, seem unable. Nonetheless, a couple of defectors from the Purple Kingdom are picking up the torch. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, the former members of Minneapolis's The Time, who have become the hottest producers in the business, have celebrated sexuality with a realistic context on Janet Jackson's Control, which they largely wrote and produced. Jam and Lewis are honest enough to exclaim the real pleasures of nasty sex, but also acknowledge that issues of control surround sex and that sometimes it's best to, quote, let's wait a while. Jackson's album is a manifesto proclaiming that a woman can enjoy sex and still make her own decisions about it. It's also a promise that some artists in pop music won't shy away from the copulated sexuality in the 1980s. And again, I just think that that's like really interesting too, because again, we've just been hearing about mostly people like the PMRC and all the like evil people who literally have, you know, been
Stick
the
up their
worst. Been the worst. So yeah, anyways. Next, we're going to read a little excerpt from a book that's going to close us out for today. And Matt.
Yeah. You want me to do it?
I have so many apologies for you for this, but I'm bringing this up for a very specific reason to close out the 80s for us today. And he'll tell you why in just a second. But why don't you read this? It's from The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom in 1987.
Let's do it. Picture a 13-year-old boy sitting in the living room of his family home doing his math assignment while wearing his Walkman headphones or watching MTV. He enjoys the liberties hard won over centuries by the alliance of philosophic genius and political heroism. Consecrated by the blood of martyrs, he is provided with comfort and leisure by the most productive economy ever known to mankind. Science has penetrated the secrets of nature in order to provide him with the marvelous, lifelike electronic sound and image reproduction he is enjoying. And in what does progress culminate? A prepubescent child whose body throbs with orgasmic rhythms, whose feelings are made articulate in hymns to the joys of onanism or the killing of parents, whose ambition is to win fame and wealth in imitating the drag queen who makes the music. In short, life is made into a nonstop, commercially prepackaged masturbational fantasy.
Now, the full title of this...
What a fucking quote.
The full title of this is something that anyone who has studied free speech in America, the First Amendment, the colleges are too liberal and are teaching our children bad science and about race and intersectionality and all that cancel culture warrior bullshit. The whole, you know, Jordan Peterson industrial complex. Anyone who studied this has heard about this book and this man in particular, the full title of which is The Closing of the American Mind: How Higher Education Has Failed Democracy and Impoverished the Souls of Today's Students.
Whew. Wow.
This is one of the books that it comes out in 1987. It is a criticism of relativism in academia and society in general, as leading, quote, paradoxically close to referencing in the book's title as Bloom's view, openness undermines critical thinking. Openness in society, meaning progressivism, being open to new ideas, being open to new sexualities, races, genders, etc., leads to undermining critical thinking and eliminating the point of view that defines cultures. It became an unexpected bestseller and eventually sold close to 500,000 copies in paperback, in hardback, in the 80s.
Wow.
And became a cornerstone of basically every right-wing fucking lunatic who has ever had an opinion about like teaching intersectional race science in college up through 2023. And do you know how I know that?
What?
Do you know how I know that? Because these 1985 ass arguments by the PMRC, these 1985 ass books by Alan Bloom, these 1985 ass opportunity op-eds by these fucking bullshit liberal ass writers are being referenced as of like right now by, drumroll please, PragerU. And I'm bringing it full circle now. I'm bringing it full circle from Marjorie Taylor Greene and Sam Smith back to the 1840s.
Let's do it.
All the way to PragerU. So this is the PragerU book club in which they read The Closing of the American Mind barely a year ago, July 19th, 2020. Wow. And we're going to start about a minute in. And I am so sorry for these beta males that we're about to experience on this podcast.
Extreme loser behavior.
I apologize for everything you're about to hear, but also I think it is important that you witness this.
fantasy.
You know, I have to tell you, it's harsh, but I think it's fair.
Well, but to one open question, is it still fair? Or is it actually far too charitable?
Did it get a lot worse since 1987?
I mean, I think if Bloom were around today and he listened to Cardi B's music, if you watch TikTok, right? You can see on TikTok people doing catchy little dances to catchy little tunes to really the most obscenely abhorrent and evil things in the world. Right? And
Mick Jagger is Beethoven compared to Cardi B or some of these modern performers.
And rock and roll is Bach.
right.
Compared to TikTok. Yeah. Right? Which is, any soul with political intelligence of even an animal recognizes TikTok is owned by an avowed enemy of the American people and is used to barbarize our souls to find evil things catchy and fun and thereby transmit vice into
Thank you so much for...
Whoa!
I feel so much worse. So much worse than ever now. It always goes into we always end up back at PragerU, don't we? Like, because they really know how to summarize the absolute
You
worst.
didn't know
this
where I
country
was
has-
going with that, did
I
you?
watched that video.
Oh,
in the
you
notes.
did?
Oh, I did. But after going through everything
no.
fully, though.
But I'm saying, before going everything, just when you watched it out of context, were you like, what the fuck is this?
Of course, no. No, it made sense, but it makes the worst sense now. It is so
And by the
much
way,
worse.
just so we know, like the worst thing in the world, the video does only have 15,000 views and only 38
like
comments.
a Facebook video
Yeah, it's a
also.
Facebook video.
Yeah.
So like, to be clear, we don't really know what the metrics are on this. I wouldn't say that this was necessarily their most popular
it
thing in the
stems
world.
from that. Like it's the core of their values.
But
honestly.
PragerU is very loud in society.
Very.
And also,
very.
just to be clear, the book club by PragerU is a podcast, I believe. So
Yikes.
take that for what you will.
Yikes.
They publish on SoundCloud, which like. Wait, I want to read
busted.
you. I want to read
How
you.
busted.
Wait, I want to read you the SoundCloud description
very
from
broke
PragerU.
behavior.
Are you ready for this?
Let's do it.
Oh my god, this podcast is only 21 minutes long. Cowards. Something is deeply amiss in American culture. Young people have lost touch with reality and have become trapped in moral relativism. Is postmodern education to blame? Education expert Max Eden joins Michael Knowles for an eye-opening discussion of Alan Bloom's unexpected 1987 bestseller, The Closing of the American Mind.
I'm sure they're experts. I'm sure.
I'm so sorry. So they only have they have 69 followers on SoundCloud, and I just love it.
420 streams.
Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. Democracy in America by Alexa de Tocqueville. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy.
All right, we gotta get out of here. This is getting
Lord of the Flies.
wretched.
The Book of Exodus from the Bible with Dennis Prager.
Oh my god.
I'm sure.
Devastating.
I'm sure it's only sex crimes in that episode, just to be clear. Well, I'm happy we led you through this. So just to be clear, part 2 is going to be about the Satanic Panic in the 80s. Once again, part 3 is going to be about obscenity trials against rap music, as well as people like Madonna and George Michael in the 1990s. And then we are also going to then be talking about, in our final part of this series, the 2000s panic about overly sexualized pop stars.
Oh yes, girl.
I hope you guys are kind of seeing the vision. I hope you guys are kind of seeing a little bit about where it is we went with this episode and where it might be going. I really appreciate all of you for listening so far, and I'm really hoping that you guys are taking a little bit away from this and share this with all your friends, because this series is really a labor of love from us, and I think it is maybe the most ambitious project we've ever worked on, as you can tell by this episode being 2 hours long.
Insane.
So-
Insane. The fact that we are barely starting.
We're barely scratching the surface.
I mean, the foundations are the biggest part, right? You know?
I had the idea to maybe like split it up at some point, but I was like, you know what? This has to
It's
be
like the Eiffel
uninterrupted.
Tower. The first third took like 90%
Them
of the time.
wasn't
and
built
then-
in a day.
And then we wrap it all up at the top.
Thank you for listening, everybody. I appreciate
Thank you,
it.
indeed. And
Okay. I have my PragerU podcast to go listen to. We don't need to plug. We already do that at the end now.
we absolutely do. But I will say this: if anyone has any kind of other relevant links or interesting things that obviously relate to this topic that you find are interesting, just feel free to send them to us. Always appreciate it. You never know what we might include in the future. So yeah, everybody, thank you.
Well,
and on that,
I have to go listen to Hot for Teacher. Hot for Teacher.
You don't really, y'all. You have to watch it and see what people think is so obscene.
The way that there's like 100 porn videos called Hot for Teacher, I'm almost positive.
All of them absolutely 100 times more crazy than
maybe
what's in that
Tipper
video.
Gore had a point.
It's just a swimsuit model, and she's in a classroom with children, and they're like murder, death immediately, like destruction of America. Yet that is like every TikTok video has something even more wild.
But think about this: there is a causal link between Hot for Teacher and Cardi B's. I'm sorry, I couldn't even figure it. Finish that sentence. Bye. You've been listening to Eating for Free, which is written and hosted by myself, Joan Summers, and Matthew Lawson, and produced by Ashlyn Thomas and myself, with music from our friend Pluto. For more information about this episode and our show, go to eatingforfree.com. And if you want weekly bonus episodes, go to patreon.com/eatingforfree, which helps support this show and keep it going. We've also got merch at eatingforfree.com/merch.